I believe I'm recording. Since I'm recording, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just to give an overview of what's going to happen here, I'm going to give my presentation, and then after I finish the presentation, there will be some time reserved for some questions from my three readers. And after this kind of period closes, I am happy to extend the Zoom meeting for any interested people with questions. Bear in mind that I did write a dissertation, so this is just a presentation of that. It's just what I hope are the key facts. Hopefully I don't go too far beyond the key facts. And I am happy to kind of supply the actual dissertation for those that have more questions about this and kind of want to get more in the dirt with what I'm talking about. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation on music and modern power, a performer's tracing of virtuosity and systems of musical value. So I submitted my proposal for the dissertation just over a year ago, and just over a year ago was right when the pandemic hit. And the first thing that happened with the pandemic was all of a sudden I had to do just the same amount of things as a musician, obviously without really concerts going on. But being in my degree, I was a part of a big musical community, and all of a sudden it was just me in my room and my books and my piano. And I just started noticing some changes happening in terms of what kinds of things did I want to play, what kinds of things did I not really care for as much, or what types of aspects of my playing itself change, what kinds of things change when you go from a community to just yourself in your room for an extended period, indefinitely. So the guiding questions of this research that changed along the way was, for whom do we learn the music we learn? Ourselves, our teachers, our audience, institutional recognition, or some prize, or for some wider cultural significance that we think these are important works. I would like to participate in the importance of these works and kind of revel in them. Another question would be, what is a canon? A rather common topic for the past 40, 50 years of scholarship. And how does it operate? What I'm especially interested in here is not so much on a societal level, how does it operate, but how does it affect individual people? Again, because it was just me in my room. So how do I relate to somebody like Bach? And kind of last guiding question, or what are the value-generating forces of musical practices? If value is something that is created, what creates that value in musical practices? So I want to be clear here that I am a performer, but when I say musical practices, I mean listening, composing, researching, teaching, discussing with friends over a coffee, just really kind of engaging with music at any sort of entry point. Now, all of this is kind of filtered through the work of Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was one of the prominent French thinkers of the 20th century. He was heavily influenced by phenomenology and existentialism, kind of the main fads of the early 20th century. And he became known for structuralism or post-structuralism, depending on where you draw that line. And Foucault did not really think of himself as a philosopher. He thought of himself as an archaeologist of knowledge. So what this means is that he was, if you read Foucault, you just think, man, where did you find these examples? Where did you find these sources? Where did you find this guy, to say this guy was a bookworm is just such an understatement. And so he finds these artifacts and he tries to describe what he sees as systems of knowledge and how knowledge is created through different time periods. And these are a few of his major works here, notably dealing with topics of internment and sexuality. So briefly here, the distinction that we want to make when I say modern power, I'm talking about Foucault's modern power, and for Foucault, modern power differentiates itself from juridical power. Juridical power is kind of what we associate with the king, the monarch who, and it's a reactive, revenge, punishment-oriented kind of power. If you commit the example that Foucault mentions is an attempted regicide that was failed in the 18th century, and the king's power needed to destroy the physical body of this criminal. So there was this opposition between the body of the criminal that was this this poor person was gruesomely tortured, and this was very well documented in the time. It was very well known. And modern power for Foucault is more discreet, it's more hidden. And instead of reactive, it's more coercive. It's based on reform, normalization of certain practices or certain identities, examination of populations, kind of codifications of populations, and hierarchical standardization. And instead of good and bad, it distinguishes between normal and abnormal. So for somebody who's interested in sexuality, this is kind of that route that Foucault is going. Instead of good and bad, we have these norms that are created. Now, there's these three large-scale paradigms that Foucault talks about. The ones that we were really concerned with here are the second and third. The second type of power that Foucault describes as occurring during the Renaissance is associated with Machiavelli. So here it's one prince, one person, and all the power is consolidated around that prince. Everything that happens in the state works towards consolidating the power of one individual. And so the prince has his little fiefdom that he has power and control over. Modern power, if you want to look at the bold at the bottom there, the political rationality of modern power no longer seeks to achieve the good life or merely aid the prince, but to increase the scope of the power itself for its own sake by bringing the bodies of the state's subjects under tighter discipline. And we're going to keep coming back to this idea, so I don't need to unpack it too much just now. The other main Foucauldian idea that we want to get to here is we don't really care about the repressive hypothesis much, but what Foucault attacks within the repressive hypothesis. The repressive hypothesis states that throughout European history, we have moved from a period of relative openness about our bodies and our speech to ever-increasing repression and hypocrisy. So in this kind of repressive hypothesis, there's this opposition between power and truth, and that power suppresses truth, and truth is something that individuals and groups need to seek out and to speak. We need to speak the truth in order to resist power, because power is a repressive agent. Foucault rejects this. He does not see power and truth as opposed to each other. In fact, Foucault holds that in order for modern power to be tolerated by its subjects, it must be masked through the creation of a discourse, historically seen in the transition from feudal systems to a centralized monarchy, which claimed the authority of the law to settle heterogeneous claims amongst local fiefdoms. Truth is one such discourse. So to reconcile all these warring princes, there's the monarchy that acts above all of these local princes, and the monarchy grants or obtains this power through the discourse of the law. As we move on, the things that we want to remember are modern power is fundamentally repressive as opposed to revenge or retribution based, and geared towards the streamlining of activities towards production. Something like orgasming or playing music is distinctly non-productive in a capitalist sense, in a modern sense, and so these things become stigmatized according to Foucault, or regulated at least. Truth is not sui generis. It does not exist on its own. Foucault sees truth, law, value, these kinds of things as constructed ideas. And by establishing discourses over the nature of truth and law, modern power insulates itself from direct attack. So Foucault here notices in the 18th century France, attacks on the French government were not kind of these ad hominem attacks. They were attacks saying that the monarchy was abusing the law itself. So the opponent of the regime still uses the discourse of the law in order to attack the regime. And so for Foucault, the whole system stays intact even though the regime changes because the discourse of the law is still in place. Now, we are here to talk about music after all. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the musical argument so you can kind of orient yourself as we go along. The main question is, where does the value lie? Do we place more value in the person or the action and result of that action? This is what I call practitioner-based versus practice-based systems. Elvis, we love Elvis the man, this image, this symbol of the man Elvis. And worship music is very much about the practice of performing the music itself. None of these are inherently better or worse, but they work differently, and that's the important part. Secondly, we're going to talk about the institutionalization and administration of musical practice that came in the 20th century. And specifically, the institutionalization and administration of musical practice was only possible, in my view, in this shift away from practitioner-based towards practice-based models. And finally, panoptic and decentralized types of power. We will get to that later. What needs to be unpacked first is, what does a practitioner-based model look like in the history of classical music? We're going to start by talking about Paris, Liszt, Thalberg, and the Schumanns, and virtuosity. Second is how we shifted away from practitioner-based models of value towards practice-based models. For this, I will talk about Brahms, Joachim, Clara Schumann, kind of the end of the 19th century. And finally, what sort of administrative instruments of power are predicated by practice-based models? Secondary education, compositions, the job search, and music festivals, just all sorts of things. So Paris in the early 19th century, practitioner-based models. The first thing to discuss here is virtuosity in music. According to Dana Gooley, one of the leading Liszt scholars, one of the leading American Liszt scholars, I should say, virtuosity is about shifting borders. So for Dana Gooley, it's not just about how quickly you can play your arpeggios and whatnot. It's about these social, it goes beyond just the keyboard and the piano or the violin or the voice or whatever it is. It's about social, cultural things. And also when we talk about virtuosity, we're talking about this culture of the traveling virtuoso, this person who is kind of, their skill takes them throughout the land to be shown. Now, virtuoso culture in Paris in the 1830s. This is where Liszt and Thalberg and many, many of Europe's top-tier artists across all mediums were gathering. So what's important to realize here is that the anthill had kind of just been smashed in France. So we had this kind of mix of falling social classes and rising, ascending and descending social classes. And a lot of immigration into Paris, as a lot of newness was happening. I mean, notably for musicians, the Paris Conservatory was founded right at the end of the 18th century. And so as one of the main pedagogical institutions, a lot of foreigners actually were trying to come to Paris, to the point where they stopped letting foreign pianists come in. So for a brief period. And this mix of different social, political, and aesthetic camps chose their own standard bearers on the concert stage. People like Romantic revolutionaries favored Liszt, who was known for his wild theatrics, his kind of massive sound, this very overwhelming type of performance and sense of being physically exercised at the piano, and also his involvement with these kind of, not really fringe, but definitely, let's just say they had a very particular and specific agenda, the Saint Simonists, a social, religious, political group. The aristocratic dilettantes favored Thalberg, known for barely moving, his operatic vocal tone at the piano. Again, opera kind of one of the favored genres of the aristocracy. So here we see kind of the image of Liszt and Thalberg in the social sense. This is what was broadcast to people. Notice that Liszt is barely he's not even touching the ground. His only physical point of contact is the keyboard. You can't even see his body. And by the way, seeing, this visual sense was very much tied to Liszt. Obviously, you can see that in this caricature. And you can see this kind of chaos of notes emerging out of his piano. Thalberg is a very, very different person here, where you have this kind of very pensive, almost melancholy figure playing. And the movement is still entrancing, beyond depiction, if you will. But it stops at the elbow, so much more contained. And this appealed to different audiences. The Schumanns, they had their own kind of brand of how they were distinguishing themselves. It's important to remember here that Robert suffered from a physical injury that stopped him from playing the piano, and so he kind of pivoted more, just started focusing much more on composition rather early on. And Stephen Stefaniak calls the Schumann's type of virtuosity a type of serious virtuosity. So serious virtuosity, according to Stefaniak, is based in the romantic aesthetic of the sublime, the allusion to natural wonder and catastrophe. So this we have in some, we can imagine some paintings of some waterfalls or this giant storm breaking, or these mountains, right? So this vast exterior landscape is supposed to trigger this kind of transcendental or wondrous experience that exists deep in the psyche or spirit of the observer. And they specifically opposed themselves to the lightweight, crowd-pleasing, traveling virtuoso. For us, we might think that, oh, then he must have hated Liszt, but actually Liszt, with his overwhelming, almost unpleasant approach to the piano, was very much what Schumann was trying to get after. So as we keep moving, Liszt and Thalberg follow suit here because the Schumanns and this culture of serious virtuosity start to attack being just a pianist. So they feel a pressure to establish themselves as composers or just about anything else beyond just a pianist. Thalberg, to do this, composes a sonata in C minor being the home turf of a certain Ludwig. And he also tries to found a méthode du piano, a very French idea, this Napoleon standardization of thought and kind of dissemination of your ideas. And his vocal tone, he published his Opus 70, L'art du chant appliqué au piano. So this is how you can play in the school of Thalberg, which is a way of legitimizing himself. Liszt, a man of serious music and pamphleteer and social activist, that's how he's trying to escape from just being a pianist. He performs symphonic transcriptions instead of writing kind of these character pieces for the piano or etudes or whatever, which he does write. But he also publishes during this time Harmonie poétique et religieuse, so clearly beyond music itself. These themes go beyond music. And chamber music marathon concerts. So if you're a soloist and you're all about your ego, the last thing you're going to want to do is play chamber music where you have to hide behind 2 or 3 string players. So this is another thing that Liszt does. And his quote-unquote social activism, or his tying of music to the St. Simonists. So crucially here, we want to understand that Liszt and Thalberg are constantly changing what they're doing so that the public sees them differently and they are characterized differently as individuals. So this was kind of typified in this duel at a wealthy Parisian patron's salon. And when they played against each other, she declared that Thalberg is the first pianist of the world. Liszt is the only one. So for her, she kind of established this categorical difference between the two pianists. The pianists were not considered on like first, second, third, fourth, fifth. They were categorically different. And this mirrors the Machiavellian mold of the prince, where you have different kind of fiefs that the pianist is in charge of. Moving on, music after 1850. So the important thing that we want to remember here is kind of this Liszt, Thalberg, going beyond piano to build a persona for themselves. And as we move into 1850, past 1850 at least, we're going to talk about Brahms, and he enters the scene as the musical foster child of the Schumanns. Serious virtuosity will eventually mature into Werktreuer ideology and the staging of authenticity. And eventually we'll have the concretization of standard performance practice repertoire, which somebody like William Weber talks about a lot. Now, we're going to shift away from practitioner-based to practice-based models here. The Schumanns, after 1850, Stefaniak points to 2 pieces of Clara Schumann, the Variations on a Theme by Bellini. So this was a standard move in the 1830s of the virtuoso pianist to copy themes of a popular opera and then make some crazy, fantastical, difficult showpiece out of it, and you go around the major cities of Europe and you play it in the salons. In 1853, just before Robert Schumann's death, she composes, and right after having met Brahms, she composes the Variations on a Theme by Robert Schumann. The type of passage work in this piece is much less outwardly virtuosic, and she tries to cultivate, this piece notably features some canons and some hidden themes throughout and some kind of the Schumannian game of putting encoded messages. So the piece itself starts to take over the message of the work instead of the person who is able to play the piece. Robert's Neue Bahnen, this famous article of his reaction to Brahms. And in this article, he writes, there were sonatas, or rather veiled symphonies, songs whose poetry might be understood without words, piano pieces, both of demonic nature and of the most graceful form. And what we want to latch onto here is that his sonatas weren't just sonatas. They were beyond sonatas. They were symphonies. His songs weren't just songs. They were something that had something so essential that they could be understood even without the words. The piano pieces were praised because of their graceful form, not because this has nothing to do with the pianist themselves, right? Brahms is praised because he's kind of going outside of what he's actually doing. Himself as the guy pushing, we're just pushing keys as the pianist, right? That's not what's interesting for Schumann here. The work does the work, not the performer. This is what I want to call the shift from bodily virtuosity to compositional virtuosity. And the important thing to understand here is that virtuosity as transcendent or sublime does not get stamped out, but rather relocated to the domain of composition. The work does the work, not the performer. Chopin's technical etudes are praised for their compositional grace, not for the fact that they're etudes. The overwhelming intensity of Robert Schumann's Opus 14 is attributed to its style and formal devices in its finale, and not necessarily, again, the person playing it. The piece itself achieves this overwhelming, chaotic feeling. And eventually, overall, we kind of see this shift away from purely pianistic forms. We see symphonic paraphrases, songs without words, fugues, and canons. Of course, there are a lot of keyboard fugues and canons, but they're a slightly more abstract musical genre than, let's say, something like the Nocturne, which is a distinctly piano genre. Shift from who is performing to what is being performed, once again, from bodily to compositional virtuosity. And this also gets this gets seen in performance practice itself and the iconography of performance, not just in how difficult your piece is to play or how complicated it is. And we know this as Werktreue ideology. It literally means work and loyalty. And this is what we know today. This is what anybody who has taken music lessons in the past 70 years knows, that you're supposed to kind of understand the composer's frame of mind and play from the soul of the composer, this kind of thing. And the staging of authenticity. The key term here is staging of authenticity. The scholar Karen Hunter has this article about staging authenticity, and she never has authenticity without staging next to it. So you can see Joseph Joachim here in this phenomenal picture that I kind of had to do a double take on, because you can see him eyes closed. There's very little that is outwardly expressive about his body. We are drawn into him, and what is he thinking about? That's what we think about when we see this. And sneaking off to the right here, we see the hand of the composer that is resting on top of these books. So in both of these photos here with the Schumanns and Joseph Joachim, we see that somebody is kind of beyond the instrument is the composer lurking. In the Schumann photo, Robert is kind of above and dominating, not necessarily in a violent or aggressive way, but certainly he's watching over her and in his thoughts. And we also see this in performance practice with the historically aligned repertoire choices. This kind of tradition that gets built. Oh, well, I'm writing after Beethoven. I'm writing after Schubert. I'm writing after Bach. So the sleight of hand that happens here, and I don't think that it's especially malicious, but it is a sleight of hand. Just like Thalberg's three-handed technique, right? It's a trick. It's a performing trick. There's nothing inherently malicious or bad about it. But nonetheless, the claim is that Werktreue and the staging of authenticity pledge loyalty to the work as autonomous and self-sufficient. They claim that the work has its own value. The abstract truth of the music does not need to rely on program for its meaning. This is the battle between absolute and program music. Individuality places a blemish on the universal qualities of the musical work. The deceit of this, at least on the part of this generation that I'm talking about, is that the Brahmsian circle, after all, sought the promotion of their music by aligning it with a hand-picked, chosen lineage. I say hand-picked, but like this, it happens on the individual level, but also as a group, right? And they too were sellouts in the same respect that Liszt and Thalberg were, because they were kind of crafting who they were as performers. The way that compositional virtuosity, for me, eventually becomes the canon has to do with this generation finally passing. So there is a fundamental inability of Clara Schumann, Brahms, and Joachim to actually practice what they preach. They say, okay, we need to treat Robert Schumann's work objectively. Robert Schumann's work has this kind of essential value and meaning on its own that is on the page. And it's just wild that that could be said about people that shared a house, that shared a family, that were so inextricably tied to Robert Schumann that they got away with saying, I'm going to treat this work for its own value. They are completely unable to ditch their association of Robert. Of course, this isn't a problem. It's hard to imagine Clara Schumann looking at a piece without actually thinking of her husband. In fact, it's well documented that hearing Robert's music often made her think of her husband. So compositional virtuosity as a value-giving system started becoming the canon when the generation that founded it passed away. By creating a value system that functions through attribution, rather than the curation of a distinct persona, they created an easily replicable system on the large scale. Nobody else could be Liszt. Liszt did all this work to create, and Thalberg, they created their image of themselves, but nobody else could be them. So the kind of stroke of good fortune that this group of musicians had was that this system of attribution and compositional virtuosity is more easily replicable on the large scale. So again here, these practices eventually won out, not because they were right or wrong, they're just more easily to duplicate. More easy to duplicate, sorry. And the descendants of this mid-19th century compositional virtuosity can be seen today in the historically informed performance practice, serialism or aleatoric composition as kind of the height of the removal of the individual agency. So Robert Schumann, they siphon off the agency of the traveling virtuoso and they say, okay, no, we're going to create these pieces. The composer kind of really regulates the meaning and the value of the work. And then in the 20th century, we keep getting farther and farther back as to it's really this musical system itself, even if it's completely arbitrary and chosen. So critical editions and the urtext regime, this urtext regime is one of my older teachers, that's why it's in quotes, previous teachers, I should say. And this kind of overvaluing of the text itself, or rather I should say for the wrong reasons, not overvaluing it. Something like the 250th year celebration of Beethoven, competitions that are named after composers, the standardization of audition repertoire, the recording of complete works. As much as I love Naxos, they're kind of just doing the rounds. And that's not so much a problem, but you have to see it for what it is. This is their program, their project. And non-biographic approaches to research and analysis that were very, very popular in the kind of early to mid-20th century. So recap so far, the 1830s virtuoso culture was set up as a practitioner-based system. Different performing styles were sustained by diverse audiences and critics. This is the Machiavellian mold. One of these fashions, one of these fiefdoms, compositional virtuosity or serious virtuosity, prioritized historical aesthetic affiliation over outright originality, which made it more easily replicable. When the generation that had founded, the kind of Machiavellian generation that had crafted their own fief, their own system of musical value, when they passed, it became fully fledged as the canon, because once they passed, then you could actually come closer to this objective kind of approach that they preached. It's easier for me to see Robert Schumann objectively than it is for Clara to see Robert Schumann objectively. So music in the 20th century. Going back to Foucault, we want to remember that modern power for Foucault is fundamentally geared towards repression rather than retribution, coercion rather than punishment. And for it to work, it needs a discourse to mask how it operates. Compositional virtuosity, Werktreuer ideology, and the staging of authenticity are all practices that combine together to create a canon-based musical culture which centers musical value in the practice-based criteria rather than the practitioner. The institutionalization of musical practices through a network of administrating bodies can only be legitimized through the existence of a decentralized value system. This is what we're about to unpack here. This leads us to the panopticon. Panopticon is a kind of hypothetical building that was designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century for any kind of institutionalization of subjects, psychological subjects like the asylum, a jail, or a school, or whatever it might be. We want to stay away from kind of the nefarious ideas that this implies and just really focus on how it actually operates. So the way that it works is that you have these rooms on the outside of the building that they have one window, or they have a one-way window is what I meant to say, from the outside of the room into the room. And there's this central part of the building, this kind of center of the donut ring there, if you will. And there is a guard, there are many guards, or there are no guards, who can look into the rooms and see what's going on in the room, but the person in the room does not know when or if they are being watched. This, for Jeremy Bentham, was a brilliant design because it means that the people that are in the rooms have no idea when they're being watched, and so they must assume that they are constantly being watched. Subjects are under pressure to correctively normalize their actions because they feel they are completely under constant surveillance, even if there's only one guard or no guard. Panoptic power and music. The panopticon is fully operational without a guard, even without a guard in the tower. It only matters that subjects feel that they are being surveyed. A discourse can also function as a regulating surveying agent. Foucault is especially interested in this in terms of sexuality and penal internment. For classical musicians, the canon and the staging of authenticity operate as the guard in the panopticon tower. Rather than acting on their own accord, musical practitioners conform their actions to align with predetermined practices. They feel they're kind of being surveyed. I mean, we're told, oh, this is how it's done. This is how it's done. But who actually knows how it's done? I mean, that's not usually what gets talked about in the lesson. It just is something that has kind of word of mouth, word of mouth, word of mouth. Modern power, we want to remember, is all about increasing. The goal of modern power is to increase its own scope, right? This is kind of U.S. foreign policy at the end of the 20th century was heavily criticized for exactly this kind of thing. The U.S., all their actions were kind of based on towards expanding the kind of sovereignty and democracy throughout the world. And the way that it achieves this is by bringing its subjects under tighter discipline. So more ways to kind of survey its own population. And the institutional deployment of modern power, institutions of all kinds combine together to create a reflexively validating system of values. They validate each other. So a university alone would be a pretty great place, but the way that actually universities and conservatories work is through the web of universities in this kind of hierarchy of better or worse schools that we all feel better or worse about getting into. They consolidate access to resources and high-level teachers in conservatories and universities. You're admitted to Festival X to festival or an orchestra because you have won a prize from competition X or a degree from school Y. So what's important here is that the value comes from other institutions. You're admitted to the festival because you have validation from another institution, and you kind of just accumulate these institutional credits and these institutional stamps. And it's very little to do with what you yourself are doing. Competitions are just a brilliant example of how this works. Competitions organize, evaluate, and hierarchize practitioners. I mean, they literally, you have first, second, third, fourth, fifth prize, and then eventually you have people that are just cut. But what is this actually based on? The competition, there's this discourse. The Chopin competition is based on the discourse of playing Chopin well, to play Chopin well. And we have many different editions of Chopin. To go to this competition, you have to go use this edition. So they regulate the discourse of what Chopin is. And the competition pretends to administer the allocation of value. But the value of the competition in reality can only be who shows up to the competition, because it's the quality of the people playing that actually determines the level of the competition itself. But somehow it gets flipped around, where the competition is at a certain level and people are trying to get validated by that competition, even though they themselves already are the value of the competition. So other institutional solipsisms include the ever-rising, so solipsism of kind of institutions kind of just being centered on themselves and just concerned with their own existence. The ever-rising price of tuition, that's just the number one thing that you could say against the fact that institutions serve practitioners. It's about the institution itself based on the discourse of the institution. So pay-to-play professional opportunities and festivals, I can say on my resume that I have performed at this venue, but I paid to perform there. I auditioned and I got into the festival, but I did have to pay. And that institutional label is now in my resume, but I did pay for it. It's not necessarily just based on my own value as a practitioner. In the 1950s, Eastman creates the DMA program, which is kind of a good example of institutions buying back their own product. They tell you that to get a job, they create a job, and then they say, this job, you need a DMA. Where do you get a DMA? From me. So you study, and you pay, and you do all these things, and you learn the discourse of the institution to then be accepted again by the institution later on. So the system of increasing the scope of the institution's own power. The 1990 Chopin competition famously did not award a first prize and therefore implicitly declared itself the winner. It said nobody is up to the standard of Chopin, the discourse of Chopin. Nobody is at that level. And so we're just going to give a second prize, a third prize, and a fourth prize. And so there's this vacuum where presumably there's the Chopin himself, well, I shouldn't say himself, but the discourse of Chopin is the first prize. So again, practice-based rather than, or discourse-based rather than practitioner-based. Music in the 21st century, the shift back to practitioner-based models. Modern power meets resistance. It has become abundantly clear to many that current practice-based models of value also serve as a way of perpetuating inequalities based on race, gender, sexuality, social class, institutional affiliation, or even just the level of your musical ability. So when we prioritize the practice itself, then it becomes much easier to categorize people and not take into, and the people who make the rules kind of are blind to their own prejudices and their own, it doesn't even need to be as malicious as prejudices. It's much more subconscious than that, in fact. And this can be seen in calls for more inclusive programming, better representation in administrative institutions. Recently, Oberlin was criticized in its concerts of Black History Month for having Caucasian artists on, or speakers on the poster. And I'm not really here to talk about Oberlin, but I am here to talk about the reaction to it, that it was extremely offensive to people, that it wasn't the music itself, it was the people that were involved that were the issue, right? So people are kind of coming back around to focusing on the actual musicians, and it's important to people, not necessarily what's being played, but it's becoming more and more important, once again, who is playing, and, who is playing what. Philip Ewell, the theorist who is based in New York. He has a blog, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, that has kind of been a giant bombshell in the Schenkerian world and kind of the scholarly theoretical world. Again, a bombshell, first of all, because of what it says, although that's not necessarily news. Really, the excitement of it all is caused by the reaction, where the Journal of Schenkerian Studies kind of, the response that it cultivated or kind of curated to Philip Ewell's Music Theory's White Racial Frame was also met with extreme, basically called out as naive and ignorant. Again, kind of the issue, Schenker as kind of one of the main people that we can think of as text-based, right, practice-based, who wants to talk about what's going on in the piece. I don't need to know that Robert Schumann tried to commit suicide right before composing this. Again, I'm not here to have that argument whether you do or don't. I'm just saying that this is not something that was valuable to Schenker, and now this is coming under criticism. So where to relocate musical value as it's starting to shift back away from this 20th century idea of practice-based models. There is a aesthetician and philosopher named Rabbi Kubala. I presume that's how to say his name. I've only had a brief correspondence with him. And his relevant articles to this topic are very recent. As you can see, one of them is titled Aesthetic Practices and Normativity. The other is Grounding Aesthetic Obligations. Now, first of all, this photo is from his professional website, I would like to say. So before, I am all for philosophers and aestheticians branding themselves this way. This is a great change. Certainly from Joachim and that kind of aesthetic. After all, it's 140 years later. So contrary to the Adorno and Schenker camp, Kubala is skeptical that we can owe what he calls an aesthetic obligation to the work itself. Schenker and Adorno all believe in kind of the greatness of the work, and we're compelled by the work. This work has an aura that we are drawn to and interested in, that's what compels us to practice and to play it and to listen to our teachers and to work hard for that audition. But for Kubala, he doesn't really believe in these articles that the work itself can fundamentally ground our sense of obligation to practice our craft. Instead, he proposes that we owe it to ourselves to investigate our attraction to aesthetic objects. So I see something on the street that I find is beautiful, and I just slow down and I look at it. And without even unpacking that, I just live in this kind of mysterious moment of contemplation of this object that I may or may not think of again. And I owe it to myself. I have this desire to kind of understand why I'm interested in it. So I study it more and I start thinking, okay, well, I really like that color and I really like that shape. And so then I can start to understand more about myself and why I'm attracted to these objects. And for Kubala, this starts to contribute to the building of what he calls the practical identity, how we see ourselves. What is your sense of self? And so kind of wrapping up here, based on the glaringly evident factors, we can expect at the very least that the institutions that currently organize and administer the allocation of musical value will significantly change. Where universities are sourcing students from, how many people are paying full tuition, how many people need scholarship, how many people are interested in participating in competitions. Are competitions really something that compared to 40 or 50 years ago, how valuable do people today see competitions? Anecdotally, I can say that the people around me are much less compelled than legend suggests by competitions. And I'd like to suggest that if we preemptively and deliberately reorganized how we allocate value as listeners, performers, composers, concert organizers, teachers, and scholars, basically any sort of association that you can, or rather involvement that you can have in music, then we better prepare ourselves for the fallout from increasing inability of institutions to address our needs as musical practitioners. In a phrase or two, this dissertation can be summed up by: musical practitioners have been trained to underestimate their own value-giving potential in order to supply the self-serving institutional systems of modern power. This, I have to believe, can be changed because it is a lie to say that musical value has always been seated in the same place, as can be seen at very least with Liszt and Thalberg. And that wraps that up. I will keep it on this final. All right, I hope everybody, it feels like kind of a car has just slowed down and okay, because I did it last night and I hadn't finished the last 2 slides and it took 50 minutes. So I really went at a breakneck speed and I will accept any and all questions that come from the pace of, from the pace that I just undertook. Let me first figure out how to stop recording. Unless, Professor Cornell, do you think it's best to, or Joshua, okay, I will stop recording then. Alrighty. So as I said, the rest of this kind of dissertation will be open first for questions by my readers, Professor Cornell Rifkin, and it is Rashana. Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, brilliant. Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
I've been here.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. No, yes, it's simply hard to find people. I'm not usually the one in charge of like keeping track of everybody on Zoom. I'm along for the ride. So, professors, the floor is now yours.
Pierre-Nicolas, this is Richard Cornell. I was struck by how unconfused popular music is in this regard. I don't think that, given the nature of the field of popular music, I think it's always been practitioner-based and was never practice-based. Lady Gaga, DMX, Jimi Hendrix, it doesn't matter. Right. These are the practitioners we value. I have a question. I guess I was running a kind of parallel train of thought, thinking about visual art and thinking about the Academy in Paris and how many of the innovations were actually happening in the Salon de Refusé. Mm-hmm. That this is a function of the curating capacity, the curating. Now I think there is more of an emphasis in our concert life of the actual curating of the concert program. That is, what gets on the stage. So my question is, in the 21st century, who do you think is responsible for curating the concerts, for determining what gets on the stage and potentially becomes canonic? And I have a follow-up question after that.
Well, it's not as straightforward because there is a rather simple answer, and then there's anybody can decide what goes on any program. The issue is if you manage to get anybody in the hall, and if nobody's in the hall, is it still a concert? Yeah. I mean, I can, so I definitely hear what you're saying. So there is kind of this awkward middle ground where every year when orchestras release their seasons, there is a kind of flurry of articles that criticize, I can't believe we're still playing Beethoven 6. It's the 4th year in 10 years that we've played Beethoven 6. So you can't really expect what I see as kind of like these, the AT-ATs for the Star Wars people here of modern power, these kind of large, slowly moving objects. You can't really expect them to do anything that is outside of the discourse that sustains them, right? And I suppose I'm just having trouble answering the question because what goes as a concert and what goes as a program it changes kind of very differently based on the setting. Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of keep working on this topic if you have you mentioned a follow-up.
Well, it was just that one might get the impression from the slides, which I don't think is necessarily in the dissertation, that the canon is a fixed quantity. It's a fixed a fixed group of works. It's frozen. Mm-hmm. Is it now possible for something to become canonic that is not now canonic?
Yeah. It's a dangerous word because it does kind of carry different things based on what period you're talking about. And you mentioned popular music and folk music earlier. When I think of some hip-hop albums from the 90s, these are certainly considered essential albums, right, or foundational albums for the genre. But nonetheless, we still have, so you could say that, you could borrow the word from classical music culture and say that these are canonical works, but that's, again, using kind of the wrong vocabulary for the wrong kind of, jazz kind of has the same problem with the 1950s as this kind of classical period of jazz. And so I think where it really becomes the canon in the classical music sense is when it becomes a part of the discourse that is used to set up these kind of institutions, right? So that would kind of separate what's something that is canonic versus something that's an essential work, right? So something like hip hop is young enough that outside of the recording industry itself, there isn't these like subsidiary or the subsidiary kind of institutional apparatuses like schools or journals or whatever it is are kind of on their way. So I think that kind of what distinguishes it for classical music is if something can be centered in the institutional discourse, because that's kind of what makes classical music unique in that way, is that it really has mobilized the value of these works towards as the basis for a system of power and a system of
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take a shot, Pierre-Nicolas.
Okay.
Full of wonderful stuff. In many ways, the presentation today clarified things that I found less clear actually in the dissertation as I was reading it, and I'm very grateful to you for sort of having come back, considered that stuff, and presented it in a way that I think makes a lot more, fit together than it had seemed to me at a previous juncture. There's much, much, much here. So let me just perhaps address a couple of matters that I think are important. I guess what strikes me most is, in fact, the depiction of these developments, these historical developments, and also the contemporary situation in terms of power, and in terms of power seen as something of necessity agonistic. There is no question that power is there, but I wonder if the Foucauldian model of power, which is a fundamentally agonistic model, as I understand it, and certainly also as you present it, is the only possible one. Such a model of power is built on hierarchies, right? The powerful, the powerless. And very often revolts against power are basically concerned with not overcoming hierarchies, but flipping them, putting those who were on bottom before on top. And I get something of this model still underlying your advocacy of a shift or shift back from, I'm sorry, a phone is from a practitioner-centered model to a practice-centered model. I'm not sure that the practitioner-centered model ever really was quite as dominant as you've proposed here, perhaps in Paris, but not necessarily elsewhere in Europe, despite the fact that Paris was in many ways the fundamental musical center in the 1830s and 40s. Similarly, I think with practice, in some ways, let's say the displacement of a certain criterion of value from the performer to the composer, which is a power shift, one might say, nevertheless I think in setting that forth, and particularly this notion of its replicability, that it gains force because, you can set it up and institutionalize it, I think that's only a partial truth, and it perhaps overlooks real properties in that different model that in fact proved compelling even to practitioners and to real musicians involved in the world of music. I speak obviously from some bias as someone who trained as a composer and who lives as a performer very much in what you'd call the historical mold. And obviously I'm an old modernist and have inherited many of those predilections, much as I would hope to challenge them too. So I think that would be my underlying worry here. And particularly when you come to the matter of reforming the situation, I don't think you really, at least I hope you don't really mean in a sense to replace the work and all of these other things that have been sort of like watchwords with the performer. To me, that again strikes a flipping hierarchies. And is there not the possibility of a model where these two things can exist in a more fruitful reciprocal relationship? I know you touch on that occasionally in spots in the dissertation, like when you talked about why you would choose to follow Schumann's articulation markings. That, as you know, was very sympathetic to me and felt very much the way I would also see this relationship. But it seems to me that you could have done and could do much more in taking us in that direction. Perhaps the last thing I'll say is that indeed, it seems to me that Kubala is positing a false dichotomy. And he's not actually changing the way anybody deals with these things. He's simply saying perhaps we should look at it from this different lens, and that might be a more accurate lens. So I'll leave just this question of how would you propose reshaping this model?
Yeah.
And I suppose I'll just add, and how will people earn a living from doing that? Okay.
Well, right. So I very much appreciate your comments and your thorough mulling over of what I've had to say. That is a huge reward for me in and of itself that I appreciate deeply. Although it may seem like it, I really am not interested in giving a plus or minus to certain historical developments, and sort of giving this was a good thing or this was a bad thing. Oh, here's where it really kind of went the wrong way. That's not really my place, and we don't really get much out of it. What I'm especially trying to focus on with this kind of work is how does it affect people today that are trying to make music, first of all, get meaning out of it personally, and as you say, of course, make a living. Now, the way that I would kind of respond to that is that despite the kind of themes of universality in some types of 19th century music that are very clearly, evidently there, universality, I think we can confuse what would have occurred to somebody like a early 19th century romantic as universal, and what we in a post-neoliberal world see as universal. And there's kind of, speaking of kind of golden ages, we can say that there's this golden age of Rubinsteins and Horowitzes and Maria Callas and like these kinds of people that are just these global stars that go across the entire globe performing, and that are hugely prized and sell out instantly. This I kind of see as this kind of, and that kind of needed an infrastructure of listeners, of agents, of people to appreciate it, right? And I think what has happened is that after kind of classical music overshot what the product can actually do, the infrastructure has now, we're left with the infrastructure, and then as the classical music, Bach, after all, famous, like, just basically never left Germany, right? So Bach's whole world is very different from our whole world, where Singapore is about a day away. So now, once classical music kind of outgrew itself and then shrank back, now we're feeling this kind of fallout that the infrastructure can't handle, is kind of overblown. So I think there's not much, what are my choices now to get a job where I get a contract that's on a year-to-year basis that is probably underpaid, and it's a hugely competitive application, and I tend to be overworked. What is the value of that to me versus maybe striking out on my own and trying to make an infrastructure, rather than participating in that infrastructure? If I try to work with kind of just in my own backyard to try to find an infrastructure that is more related, that is better related to what I think the work itself can actually do. And there I return back to valuing the work in what I think is a healthier way, where rather than just assuming that Beethoven's Ninth is something that needs to inaugurate every open ceremony of whatever is going on in South Africa and Melbourne and New Delhi and wherever. So I think the alternative that is proposed is not exactly. First of all, it's just like the poor glaciers. It's ever receding in this world, and so that's not especially compelling to try and reach out for as an option. And so that's trying to find some other. I've had my own little forays into this sort of thing myself, but I don't really need to talk about those. I think just reformatting things, the infrastructure of music to not be a global or national thing, but just be based on the city itself, is something that a musical culture will be, at least in classical music, the music itself. Like, pop music is composed and conceived as a global product. Pop music, it's such a giant thing. But when we were talking about Lady Gaga, of course, like, this is something that she's not writing for the people, her flatmates or whatever. So that's, yes.
Thanks.
Can I ask a quick question? I know I've been asking you nitpicky questions for months now, so I'll keep this one short so then everyone else can ask questions and you can get insights from them. I was really interested in where you started when you talked about being in isolation as sort of the seed for this whole project, right? And thinking about, like, the body of the practitioner. And I was sort of curious what you make of how technologies and social media, will that impede? I know I'm asking you to, like, predict the future here, basically, but
I'm here for it.
Get your magic 8 ball out. But so do you see that sort of as problematic for these more kind of practitioner-based, bodily-based, corporeal practices, or, like, ways of performance that you're thinking about? And I was thinking about this with students in one of my classes because we were watching a recent documentary about DJs and quarantine and, like, what does it mean to live stream. And one DJ in particular, she had this phrase, like, she was like, I don't want to live stream because clubbing is cultural and it's not just entertainment. And I thought that really stuck with me, like, this idea of something as being cultural in that way, and something that is already so mediated, right, to then be remediated. So I was just wondering if you could kind of, like, say a little bit about your thoughts of how that might or might not be an obstacle to what you're asking.
The history of technology and music is fascinating and pretty heated. You can think about Bob Dylan going electric as a famous example, or in, like, the underground hip hop scene in New York, where people were even being criticized for recording and record, right? Live, it's clubbing is a culture kind of thing. Okay, so in that way, even recording it and listening to it on your headphones is also going against that kind of culture. You have pianists that even today don't really want to be recorded. Or don't give interviews or this kind of thing. So ultimately, it's such a, the history of the internet is kind of this Napster and kind of the dark web or whatever. There's this, everybody knows that the internet is always about some sort of undercurrent, is kind of behind what's not really seen, right? These transferring things kind of outside of the regulation of law. So that's just something that has to be accepted, that cannot really be, that's just such a Sisyphean task. And I think a positive way to understand that and to approach that would just be, that's one possible way for a practitioner to then cultivate their identity. I mean, you have people that are YouTube stars versus TikTok stars, right? Zooming out, they're different, but they have different practices and different techniques. Or a very popular Twitter account has different techniques than a very popular Instagram account. So it's all ways for individuals to ultimately diversify what they're going to do, and whether they do that successfully is up to their own canniness. And so that's kind of how I see that. I mean, if people can make an online club environment and people are compelled by that, then that's all you need. Ultimately, it's about making a meaningful experience for people. And if that is something that's, my argument, I guess, is that through the institutionalization of modern power, classical music, the practice of playing music, we're decreasing the potential for it, we're decreasing the potential for classical music to be used as something to develop your practical identity, right? Because the first Mozart sonata I played was in my DMA, and I played a fair amount of Haydn, a lot of Beethoven, and I just always felt there's somebody that's going to tell me the slurs are not right, or the sound isn't right, and I was always playing somebody else's music, and there was no opportunity for me to play Mozart in a way that I was going to be constantly running away from this teacher that told me to play it this way or this, and I was always going to be burdened by what somebody else was telling me to do. And this was not rebellious. This was just like, this isn't my turf. I can't say anything about Mozart. So that is, there was no opportunity for me to make something meaningful out of Mozart. That's what I felt. And then finally, I got over all these self-conscious things, and I played a lot of Mozart my first 2 years of my DMA. I think it really comes down to restoring classical music and playing classical music as something that is fundamentally valuable rather than just participatory for individuals. Something that contributes to their own sense of themselves rather than some sense of obligation in a poor sense of the word.
Thank you.
All right. I'm just shocked that it is only 8:10. I sincerely thank everybody for showing up. There are people from all over my life, and I value each of you being here. I will keep the Zoom call open probably for another 10, 15 minutes to keep chatting with people if there's individual reactions. There is, of course, the dissertation that I wrote that I will be continuing to be revising for the next 2 weeks with the generous comments and reflections of my readers. That will be available for anybody interested in kind of... There's obviously a lot that I didn't talk about in this presentation that is covered in the more details, more kind of nuances, more individual characters in this kind of arc that I want to see. So I guess the closing word that I want to say before opening it for other questions is that anybody that reads this dissertation or is still going to be thinking about what I've said it's really not about history, but rather one of the things that I was thinking about here is that we have a way of looking at history that we look at everything that is different, and that's what history is. History is everything that is not now. And one of the things that I kind of started changing as I was doing this research and thinking about these things was, if we look at history as everything that has stayed the same, and especially for musicians, you kind of start to feel this underlying idea of why we like music in the first place. And people are in very different eras and very different circumstances. But the more you kind of jump around, the more you kind of get this underlying sense that the thing that you feel when you are listening to a piece of music kind of compels people in a similar way. Maybe that's an overreach, but that's at least the intuition that I was developing. And it's about connecting with that part of music history rather than focusing on everything that is different. So, because that comes for free. It is not 1839. So, all right. I don't know if people want to queue up in the chat, perhaps. Certainly hang around. Well, sorry.
Pierre-Nicolas, could you stop your screen share so we could all see everybody?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thanks.
Thank you for helping me there.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
All right. I'm just catching up with Jing here. All right. So, without being too sloppy about this, if anybody has anything to say, I'm all ears. Michael.
Congratulations, first of all. I was struck by the Kubala quote about examining pieces and why we're attracted to them as aesthetic options rather than assuming there is natural inherent aesthetic worth to them just because of historical biases. And with that in mind, I was thinking about what might happen if we all started to do such a thing. And there is a concern to me that because of the almost survival instinct of our community and field, that we would ascribe aesthetic enjoyment to the same works because of our historical bias. And what does that say about ourselves as performers? How could we move beyond that in a meaningful way? Is it just then to suggest we have to have a reformation of the canon, which is additional, and that would be a solution to this kind of focus on a specific number of works by a specific number of people? Is that enough? And that kind of brought me to this idea of music being something that we enjoy, and how our neoliberal society kind of puts pressure on all of us to commodify pleasure. There's the constant pressure to turn your hobbies into a side hustle, or share your love of something in a way that makes money. And I think that a large reason that institutions have branded classical music as a universal collective is because of that instinct to reach as many people as possible and to create profit. So I guess I'm wondering, what is a way to move forward as a performer? And I know this is a very heavy question, but what do you think roles as a performer are in a way that are self-reflective and critical, or at least conscious of our formation of the canon?
Basically, I hear what you're saying. And I think the place to start there is that you can get as far as you want in the institutional kind of apparatuses of classical music without any sort of integrity, right? You kind of just have to, there are clear buttons that you have to push. You have to play this piece this way. It has nothing to do with what you think about that piece. So it's just about how you're playing it, that practice-based model. So it has nothing to do with what you value yourself. So as a performer, the first thing that you would probably have to do is just not care what other people think. And I know that gets talked about a lot and but genuinely, it's like me with this Mozart thing of I just didn't play Mozart until my DMA. I think that as we switch back towards, an important thing that I want to say is that if we're going to switch back towards, by the way, practitioner, practice-based models, they're always constantly both going on, obviously, right? It's not one or the other. It's just right now we live in a world that is heavily predominated by practice as valuable rather than individual people as valuable. So if the individual person is invaluable, if you're just going to get another competition winner that comes in and they're on stage, they're on the BSO stage because they won that competition, it has nothing to do with their integrity as a performer. So teaching, writing about music, all of this needs to be understood as sharing something that is valuable to you. I talk about this with my students sometimes, like when you're playing a piece, there's this very animalistic sense of if you're walking down the street and then you see somebody that's just staring into the sky, you're going to kind of look in the direction that they're looking. And there's this fun, if we see somebody that's captivated by something, then we are pay attention to that and we follow along. And that's just something that you have to believe that as a performer, that it's not about that. I want to believe that in the hall, they're really, if they're bored or not bored, it's not because of Beethoven. It's because of how much I am involved in what I'm doing and how much I'm pursuing my own attraction to that. So I don't think that switching back towards practitioner-based models compromises the integrity of the piece at all, because you can be drawn to anything. I have one of my piano students told me that she started taking piano lessons she took piano lessons as a young person, as a kid, and then hated it, and then was very, very distant from music, and then all of a sudden had this epiphany, and now music all the time, constantly thinking about music, constantly just as amazed by it, right? So we're never really prepared for when something is going to be this kind of, we're just drawn to it instantly, right? And that ultimately comes down to the performer building a sense of integrity and audiences and teachers addressing that integrity as what is valuable, instead of did you pedal through the rest or did you not pedal through the rest? So yeah, I hope that kind of answers what you're. In a more pragmatic sense, I simply think that we need to get out of this idea that classical music is a global thing. To be a successful classical musician is to play in a way that means something to the people immediately around you, not to create the perfect version of the Beethoven Sonata. Penny, hello. I hope I'm not okay.
Hi, Pierre. No, it's totally fine.
Okay.
You did a great job. It's such an interesting paper and so well written, put together, and kudos to you and to your dissertation advisors as well for steering you in the right direction. So my question is just a very kind of general question. So if you think about that, making music sort of global, and so as your friend Michael put to it, that it's about making it have a monetary commodity put on it all the time. And for me, that kind of goes in line with the gig mentality. Well, I can only do it if I'm going to get paid for it. Or in the singer world, everybody's got which there's like a lot of kickback right now, but you've got to all look the same. You've got to have the perfect package. You all have to sound the same. You can't have any individuality in your voice. So for me, it becomes, and it's part of what you're talking about, I think, just in a different language, it's kind of a homogenization of music in a way.
Definitely.
And I think that makes it generic. And then we lose what's really special about individual people and their personalities coming through and their love of all different kinds of music. And I think when you're trained that way, as opposed to the way people are now in some ways, I mean, I come from the other way. I come from the be who you are way, as you know, Pierre. And that might ruffle feathers along the way when you, like for me, I like a big palette of music. And one of my students said, I can't really tell what your favorite kind of music is. I said, because I don't have one. I have a huge bag of it, and I like that. And I think that contributes to me as a teacher and as a performer. But I think we live in this other music world where everybody's supposed to kind of be put into a box. Mm-hmm. And also they're supposed to be in a box and how they are at school and how they think about music and how they choose or don't choose music. And I think opening that up just makes the performers and the research and everything far more interesting and compelling.
Yeah, I think the big issue with that, I fully agree with you. And I think the fact that the ability to enjoy many, many, many different kinds of music, I think is symptomatic of your attention to kind of imagining who the person is behind it rather than just the music itself, right? One of my favorite questions to ask about when I listen to any piece of music is, what world needs this music? And whether that's a contemporary world from another culture or from, trying to understand how loud what my dynamic range should be in when I play Bach on the piano. Mm-hmm. What world needs this music? And then that can try to answer the question of how loud I should play on the piano. The issue is that in these kind of practice-based models, we really have, like you say, the standardization. And the standardization is what allows it to be global. Mm. And so I think a lot of people are going to be upset as we start to shift away from these kinds of as we start to have more individuality, mm-hmm. then the global setup of classical music is not going to be possible, which isn't a bad thing. It's just that I think a lot of people are going to be upset about it because the people who are in that 1% are going to be losing their paycheck or whatever it is. So, but there's a lot more opportunity for everybody else that isn't on that global concert circuit, who is playing for people in a hall that they booked themselves, or whatever it is, then there's going to be a lot more, most of the concerts that I play, nobody knows the music on the program.
Right.
And so what do they, they really are excited by me playing piano. And it's the inside the music culture and how we have organized ourselves that ignores that. I definitely see a system where it's like, instead of, as much as I love the guy, instead of Daniel Trifonov running around the globe playing these concerti and playing them so friggin' well, instead of that, where he has a different audience every night, mm-hmm. I think it probably has to shift to a system where you have a recurring audience that is loyal, that is, again, valuing the person, and the person is then beholden. They have to have a certain integrity and a responsibility to their recurring audience to provide some sort of musical result, Yep. So I think that I totally agree with you, but I think that just, again, I want to get to this idea of the canon as something that legitimizes institutionalized global music, right? It's not just a set of works. It's a foundational premise for this kind of decentralized idea that allows for the mass production of at least like this kind of decentralized reference point of what is good Beethoven and what is good this, good that. So
I get it.
Yeah. I'm sure that we'll have more conversations individually with anybody that's here, but if there's anybody that has something springing to mind. Brett, I would like to bring Brett to the floor because Brett is somebody, I'm just going to indulge here. Brett is somebody that made a vast impression on me on my first week at BU, and has inspired me in many ways. And although we have regretfully not spent very much time together, I still feel a certain kinship with Brett, and I would love to have him somehow involved in this to bookend my kind of BU time.
Thank you, Pierre. I was not expecting that. That means so much.
No. I see there is another question from Nick Joliet here, so we can kind of keep things brief as we round out.
Well, congratulations. I can't wait to read the dissertation, and even more, can't wait to talk about it. I guess one thing that comes to mind, I guess, you talk about this flip, right, around 1850. Right. Nice number from practitioner to practice, right?
Oh, right.
And I guess my question to you is, we all kind of know that like something happened, right?
Right.
Like between 1800 and 1900, we all kind of know. But I guess, did something actually happen, or is this a way we have started talking about the relationship between music and performance? I'm thinking about like, Reinhard Strom has a very nice article responding to Lydia Gur's book where he talks about how much of what she complains about happening in 1800 actually happened like in the 1960s, right? And I also can't help but just speculate that like any idiot in Paris in 1825 could tell the difference between a written piece of music and someone's performance of it. Mm-hmm. And the same goes for 1875 and I don't know, Leipzig. And so, just thinking historically versus historiographically, like it's the written form of music that endures, right? And since about 1900, also recorded audio. And but still, like we still talk about Klemperer's Beethoven or Furtwängler's Schubert, like those, even in the most sort of archetypal canonic space, we still recognize the practitioners and their role in what's happening. And so this is not something maybe to answer in this forum, but it's something we can talk about, and I look forward to reading also what you've come up with in the dissertation. But I guess the question, there's this twofold sort of timeline, this two-sided timeline where there's like what actually was going on in history and how that narrative has been written to support the various structures.
Yeah. So I think, just in quick response to that, the flip, I think I try to make that distinction. And by the way, I have a whole section about Lydia Gerb response in the dissertation and this whole year 1800 thing.
Of course,
so, yeah, of course. So at any rate, I try to make the distinction between the canon only became the canon once the first generation died, because then it became this decentralized discourse. When Clara Schumann and Brahms and Joachim were using what we now call the canon and kind of starting to, it was starting to coalesce. It was no different than, it was just branding. It was just artistic branding. Whether it was sincere or insincere is another question. It was branding. It was their brand. And so in that way, it was very centralized because it was what they themselves said they were doing. Even though they said, oh no, it's objective. Right? And then after they pass, it becomes a discourse that gets mobilized for other things beyond just what they were doing. So the flip that happens is there are two kind of levels to the flip. So sorry to put you on the spot there, Brett. That was just a moment of me indulging.
No, I'm ever grateful for friendship. I'm so glad to know that I played some minor role in this. So congratulations.
Nick, sorry I skipped over you there.
Oh, it's all good. Hey, Pierre-Nicolas, that was really cool. I don't know, as like somebody who lapsed on the sort of professional musical path at some point, I enjoy thinking about these things. So this might end up being a little bit redundant with the second most recent performer, it's a questioner. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I was thinking about a lot was, something that I think has been remarked upon a lot is, in the history of performance since recorded media started being a thing, there's been this influence to get more perfect and more standardized. You have this like trajectory from like Cortot and Schnabel and these people who are like quote unquote like messier or whatever by today's standards, and obviously could be even more of a contrast if we could go further back, but ironically we only go as far back as
the performance of Brahms, by the way, who was famously messy and prepared for most of his concerts.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that fits in there. But I was just thinking about how, those people, for one thing, like, is that just a continuation of this trajectory of the sort of practice focused thing? And then also, like, given that standardizing influence, I was thinking about it. There's something a little bit maybe ironic that happens where, like, on the one hand, these recordings kind of enforce the standardization, and thus they like make the performer redundant, or more redundant at least, and they enforce the practice. The practice, the one that's focused more on compositions and stuff.
Sure.
And the texts. It kind of enforces that, but, you wonder also if that, to some extent, if that dynamic eventually blows itself up, because eventually performers want to have something to do and something to offer, and people respond to that too.
Yeah. I think the idea of redundancy is redundancy in what context, right? It's only redundant in a certain context. So, and I think that it's one thing that I've always kind of been interested in is in class, like in other types of music, the idea of the guy that's kind of handing out his CDs on the corner, or in kind of this fad of kind of underground music nowadays that releases their music on tapes, cassette tapes, as a way of controlling who is listening and kind of creating this more tight-knit, not mass-produced approach. So recording isn't all in that direction, It's, again, just recording how it's been used and mobilized by classical music. There's this quote that I have been searching for in all this reading I did, that I read it and then I wrote it down, but I wrote down the wrong page number in this like giant stupid book of Adorno where all the essays are in one. And it would just be better if they were in different books. Anyway, he complains, Adorno, who we kind of, I won't really start talking about him, but he has this quote where even Adorno starts complaining about this annoying habit that chamber music groups have of always playing together. And it's just great. It's just great. And now everybody plays everything together all the time, And there are some pianists, sorry. There are many musicians I know of the pianists who are starting to kind of break this trend. Notably, there's a Dutch pianist, Jan Schultz, who has recorded a lot of Schubert and Brahms. And if you listen to his performances of Brahms, of course, he plays all the right notes, but the sense of ensemble is vastly different, the sense of rhythm. And when he plays the violin sonatas, he's almost never the only time that he's with the violinist is on the final chord of the movement. And there's this different stage. And I wouldn't know about this way of playing without recording, right? That's
true.
Switzerland. So it's again, in what context and how is it being used? And just again, certain tools get used by what Foucault would call modern power as a way of advancing itself. You can use the same thing you can use the same technology to do something kind of different. So I definitely hear what you're saying, and it's an undeniable trend, but I would also say you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because I wouldn't be exposed to the things that have given me these outside-the-box thoughts if it wasn't for this otherwise homogenizing technology.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Great answer. Thanks.
Yeah. I know Jane had a question, but is there anybody? We'll probably have one more question after Jane, and then we'll finish because you lovely people are going to be held hostage at some point.
Maybe there's somebody else who should go before me.
Oh, okay. This is a never-ending discussion at any rate. Jane, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I thank you, Nicholas. That was really profound and all over the map in good ways. And I'm really interested in the performer-composer distinction that you pointed out in the 19th century. It puts me in mind of physicists and psychologists in the late 19th century, the theorists and the experimentalists, right? And the tension between theory and experiment. And so I see a parallel there between performers and composers. And I am wondering if that is a false dichotomy or is that a thing? And so for example, in my field, I think of...
Oh, I was about to say if you could give
Yeah. So I think of Freud. I think of Freud in the late 19th century and Wundt, both Germans doing theory and experimentation. And so I see this parallel with the performers and the composers that you so brilliantly told us about. And is there a parallel there in those movements and moments? And but is that a false dichotomy? Like, where does that break down between? Yeah.
I would say it's if I say it is or isn't a false dichotomy, both answers are wrong because there's definitely some parallels because the kind of concretization of the canon as a discourse is happening right around the turn of the 19th century. That's when really things get kicking into full gear. But at the same time, I think there's a much more, there is still a pretty symbiotic relationship between composers and performers. Edward Storyman and Schoenberg, for instance, or Yvonne Loriot and Messiaen, or what's his name? The American pianist. Somebody help me out. Henry.
Sorry, who and which pianist, Pierre?
The American pianist, mid-20th century, famous for playing all these extremely difficult pieces, creating a lot of new works.
David Birch, David Tudor.
David Tudor. Thank you very much. David Tudor. But anyway, there's these famous performer and composer relationships. So maybe the composer now gets like the billboard written about them, but they work very, very closely with performers. Yvonne Loriot was the wife of Messiaen, eventually. She played a lot of his pieces and his pieces were written for her. So it's again more from the outside than from the inside is how I would answer that question. The dichotomy is from the outside rather than from the inside. And that's always been the point. That's been the point with Brahms and Schumann is that there's this kind of how it's seen from the outside is different than what's actually happening. The objectivity that Clara Schumann said she had about how to play the chromatic fantasy and fugue was nothing more than her own subjective opinion.
But you drew that dichotomy, and I wonder where that intersection.
Well, yeah, I drew that dichotomy for the ease of talking about it.
Yeah.
The real world is a messy place.
Yeah.
But I hear what you're saying. And again, I would say that from the inside of the industry, it's much more symbiotic, and it's about how that actually gets used externally and how it gets sold to people and how it gets packaged as a brand. There you could draw the dichotomy, but on the inside.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Lovely people. Thank you for sticking around. It's probably time to pull the plug. And as each of you are close to me in your own way, this conversation is surely not over. So, cheers. Have a good evening. Bye.